Production, can you? Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Good. So for those, hold on, I have to put some order here on the desk. And yes, so microphone. For those of you who have been following my first 3 lectures, meaning the last 3 Tuesday, same time. The first 2 weeks I was online. Last Tuesday, I was here with you in another room. So for those of you who followed these 3 first lectures, it was a general introduction to what I call ways of making, explaining how hand making, mechanical machine making, and digital making represent different technical logics. Now, normally, when I teach a seminar over many months, that is the beginning. And then tonight, being lecture number 4, I would have started to tell the story, the chronology of digital design, starting from 1935, 1948, the first step of cybernetics and then artificial intelligence. But we decided to change that plan a little because tonight the audience is slightly different. There are some of you here who did not follow that sequence of lectures. And so I will, instead of starting from the very beginning of that chronological sequence I had in mind, I would go fast forward to the very end. Because if this were a seminar I teach over 6 months, this would be the last lecture. So I'm going to the end of the story, and then over time, we shall go back to the beginning. So the topic I will present tonight is related to contemporary event, stuff which is happening right now, generative AI and how it relates to architectural theory. Not only the content is likely different from what we did in the last 3 weeks, the format is also different because I will not be teaching as in a class, which is what I've been doing for the last 3 times we met. I will be reading a formal paper, which is going to make it a bit boring, perhaps, but bear with me. In compensation, it may be a bit shorter, and then we shall have more time for questions and answers. So let's start from the beginning, which is that since the summer of 2022, which is 2 years ago, everyone has been obsessed with generative AI. First, because nobody had seen it coming, almost nobody. For example, I didn't. So when it came, it was a shock. Second, because some find it promising, many find it frightening. Never mind that for the time being, what generative AI can actually practically do amounts to not very much. But, more is still to come. But above and beyond all that, I have a feeling that there may be something else going on with generative AI right now. Something strange, creepy, sneaky, yet pervasive, and potentially momentous. In short, in 2 lines, generative AI is, in my opinion, reviving some very old, actually ancestral, traditional art theories, which we thought we had successfully eliminated from contemporary art and design in the course of the 20th century. However, let me add an important disclaimer from the very start. When I say that generative AI is reviving some principles of pre-modern art theory, I am referring to one tradition, to the history of Western European art, because that's the only story I know. Now, I have the feeling that many of my arguments could equally apply to the history of some non-Western art, including Eastern art, because in very general anthropological terms, the ways of making, that was my topic for the last 3 weeks, the modes of production in all pre-industrial, pre-modern, artisanal cultures have inevitably many points in common. But I cannot prove that because that's precisely the part of the story that I do not know, which is why I am happy to be a guest of your university for a little while, So hopefully I can learn the basics of that part of the story that I never studied at school. But for tonight, let me start by telling you the part of the story I know. And then perhaps you may tell me to what extent it matches the part of the story you know. Because at the end of the day, generative AI is the same for all. And we all have to deal with it, east and west, and north and south, because generative AI works just the same everywhere. So this story I'm going to tell you is a story that started a very long time ago. So let me start from the beginning of the European classical tradition, which is from what we call classical antiquity, the Greek and the Roman. Now, the ancients of classical antiquity, the Greek and the Roman, strange as it may appear to us today, because we had theories on everything, particularly the Greek, but they did not have theories on what we now call the fine arts. They didn't have even a notion of what we call the fine arts. They had artisans. Artists did not yet exist. Where we moderns have formulated complicated aesthetic principles on the modes and functions of imitation in painting, sculpture, and architecture, the Greek only had some fancy tales, just storytelling, recounting how some craftsmen, on some occasions, managed to make stuff that looked natural, that looked as if it had been made by nature. The term, which is used in English to refer to this practice, called mimesis, but don't be surprised if speaking English as a foreign language, you have never met this term, because most of my English-speaking students have never met this term either. Philosophers use it. In daily life, we don't. But mimesis, in the original Greek, was mimesis. In English, mimesis. It means imitation of nature. Imitation of nature was the purpose of classical art. So there was one very famous ancient Greek painter whose name was Zeuxis, or Zeuxis, spelling Z-E-U-X-I-S. We don't even know if he even really ever existed. It's a mythical figure. There are many stories about him, but we have no evidence that he actually existed as a person. But this guy, Zeuxis, pronounced in English as Zeuxis, but you spell it Z-E-U-X-I-S, and the Greek read it Zeuxis, but never mind. Now, he was famous for this story. Once, he painted grapes that were so lifelike that the birds came down to peck at them, as in this 19th century paint. You see what happened? He has painted grapes. And the grapes look so good and so natural that the birds, not being particularly intelligent, because they're just birds, they fly to the painting and they try to eat the painted grapes. And of course, they can't, because then they break their beak, and because they're not real grapes, they're painted grapes. So that proved that, is there an issue?
No, that's right.
What's going on?
It's just
Pause. That's good. I
sorry.
can take breath.
I just want to.
What's the problem?
Oh, sorry about that.
That's the next.
Uh,
This meeting. I think it's okay. We can. You didn't want the line on the top to show up? That's perfectionism. I mean, most of the picture is readable. So that was the story of Zeuxis, this guy. He was such a good painter, but he painted grapes that were so realistic that the birds were cheated into thinking that they could eat them. But of course they could not, because it's a painting, it's not real. Now, he had a rival in another story. He was called Parrhasius. Again, we have no evidence that this guy ever existed. But there was a competition between two painters, Zeuxis and Parrhasius. And that's the story you see in this 18th century engraving. So on the right-hand side, you see Zeuxis' entry into the competition. He has painted the grapes, and the birds, you see, they're flying because they are being cheated and they think that they can eat the grapes, the story I just told you. And so it was a competition with these two painters. So Zeuxis painted the grapes. You see, haha, you see, good painting. The birds are even, cheated into thinking they're real. And you, Parrhasius, that's the other painter on the left, what did you paint? And Parrhasius said, well, my painting is behind this curtain. Come and have a look. And so Zeuxis comes here and he pulls the curtain to see the painting painted by his competitor. And surprise, surprise, the curtain is painted because that was a trick. And so Zeuxis made this argument. Well, I cheated the birds into thinking that my grapes were real, but you cheated me into thinking that the curtain is real. So since I cheated the birds and you cheated me, and they are more intelligent than the birds, you are a better painter than me. You see how it worked. This is how Zeuxis, in this case, got the second prize, and Parrhasius, who painted the faked curtain, got the first prize. Now, the same Zeuxis, the same guy, figures in another quite different story, which is the following. He had been invited to a town in what would now be the south of Italy. He was from Greece, so had to travel, 2 weeks in a boat to get to the south of Italy, because a city in the south of Italy offered him a lot of money to make a painting of a very beautiful goddess. I forgot which goddess it was, but she had to be particularly good looking. And the story, as it goes, is that Zeuxis arrived in this city in the south of Italy, and to paint this very beautiful lady, he looks for a model. He needs a very good-looking girl to make a painting of a very good-looking woman. And he goes around town looking for his model, but he doesn't find a single model, a single local girl who was good-looking enough to be used as a model for his painting. And so he goes back to the city elders who had invited him and tells them, listen, I cannot find a good model. Let's do it this way. I choose 5 of your girls, and I use all 5 of them as a model, which is what you see in this painting. There is Zeuxis, the painter, making one painting out of 5 models, because he couldn't find one single model to his taste. So he had to make a collection of 5, and from each of the 5, he chose something. The nose from one, the lips from the other, etc., etc. So his painting was a fusion, a blend, an assemblage of features taken from all 5 models. And it met with great success, hence the lasting popularity of the anecdote, which has been retold and even illustrated many times, particularly in the Renaissance and in late Victorian times. Seen today, some of these paintings, even when painted by old masters, make us a little bit uncomfortable due to their evident sexism. This is, for example, one rendering of the story by a famous Renaissance painter, Vasari, the friend of Michelangelo. And this is a painting which Vasari painted in his own house in Florence, just 2 blocks from Santa Croce. And you see the painter, Zeuxis, and he has 3 models on one side and 2 models on the other side. But the long and short of it is that, well, you cannot deny that there is one fully dressed man looking at 5 mostly undressed women. And let's not presume that we are the first to realize that this is and was always seen as a somewhat questionable, deplorable story. This is, for example, the take of another painter. This is the take of a female painter. This is Angelica Kauffmann, a neoclassical painter. She was a prodigy. She was born in a little village in Switzerland, late 18th century. Then she moved to a little village in Austria. Then she moved to Rome. She spoke 6 languages at the age of 18. She was a fantastic painter, specializing in portraits. She befriended all the artists of the time. When she moved to London, when she was the first woman to be accepted into the Royal Academy of Arts. And this is the painting she made to illustrate the story of Zeuxis. You may notice that there are only 4 models in the painting. Zeuxis' painting, there are 4 models. Model number 5, look at the opposite end of the painting. This is model number 5. And you may notice that she is not undressed, she is fully dressed, and she is trying to get hold of the painter's brush. This is a self-portrait of Angelika Kauffmann herself. So she puts herself into the story, indicating that she wants to be a fully dressed painter, which she was, and not an undressed model. So this was 1770 something, about early feminism. But from the point of view, it was 1778 to be precise. From the point of view of art theory, however, and even of the theory of human knowledge, this tale conceals a number of theoretical problems, issues. First objection, first think of it, if Zeuxis already had an idea of perfect beauty in his mind, why did he need to imitate any real-life model, 1 or 5 or in any number? If he already knew what beauty looks like, he could just close his eyes and make a painting. No need of copying from any real model. If, on the contrary, he did not have already in his mind an idea of beauty, how could he choose among so many incomplete manifestations of the idea? The conflict between realism and idealism in the arts has found many different solutions throughout the ages. From a more practical point of view, the technicalities of Zeuxis' mode of artistic operation, the parsing, selection, and the reassembly of parts coming from many models, have all equally invited a never-ending stream of theories and speculations. Evidently, the artist, Zeuxis, could not have limited himself to just cutting and pasting a number of pieces, as in a puzzle. He would most likely have had to rework, modify, and adapt some of the parts, not only to polish the edges, but also more generally to make them blend with one another, merge in a single composition. Hence the question, how much of Zeuxis' operation was what we today would call a collage, cut and paste? And how much of it would have been some more creative form of imitation, the work of an artist, only vaguely inspired by some of his models? Could people look at his finished painting and tell, see, these are the eyes of model number 1, the nose of model number 2, the lips of model number 3, etc. Or did he blend all of his sources in one transfigured, literally supernatural composition, where one would say, see, there is a certain undefinable something, sorry, spelling mistake, undefinable something, in this portrait that reminds me of all the models. But it's hard to tell what precisely comes from each. In classical art theory, this would have been seen as the best way, meaning not the cut and paste, but the blending and transfiguration, because that's the way nature itself works. For example, this is the way children often look like one or the other, or even both of their biological parents. This, according to classical theory, is what creative artists do. Creative artists absorb, transform, and transfigure their sources. They make something new out of them, where the new whole is better than any of the original part. This is what the ancients called creative imitation. Imitation that creates something new. And that's the same time a creation that imitates something old. These classical principles, all these stories go back to the Greek and the Roman, say 25 centuries ago or 20 centuries ago. These principles acquire a new urgency during the Renaissance, which is only 5 centuries ago. An entire civilization that aimed at the revival of the classical world. A revival to be obtained through an intelligent or creative imitation of the classical past. Imitation was the core paradigm of Renaissance culture, the foundation of all its sciences and arts and life. Strange as it may appear today, at the start of what we still call the European modern age or era, more or less around the time when Columbus was discovering America, 1492. A humanist was a scholar specializing in the imitation of classical Latin, in the imitation of the way of writing of classical authors who had been dead for 15 centuries, writing in a language that nobody spoke anymore. Likewise, Renaissance architects, including many famous ones that you all have studied at school, they designed buildings that had to look ancient, and their ancient look was obtained through the creative imitation of classical buildings or what remained of them or what was known of them. This is a Renaissance book with an illustration of what they knew of classical antiquity, mostly ruins. And this is where Renaissance artists were obliged to invent a new mode, a new practice of imitation. Today, we would say imitation 2.0. Renaissance artists learned to imitate the form of an artistic model, but only its form, without its content. For example, they started to imitate Cicero's writing. Cicero is a famous writer of the time of Julius Caesar, while expressing new ideas that did not exist in Cicero's time. And architects imitated classical architecture while designing building types that did not even exist in classical times. Christian churches, for example. This is a very famous case in point. It's one of the most famous buildings of all time. Leon Battista Alberti, Sant'Andrea in Mantua, and we all studied it at school. We did, I presume you also did. But think of the assignment which Alberti received in 1450. He had to build a church for the Christian religion. And at the same time, he had to imitate the spirit, the look of buildings of classical antiquity when the Christian religion did not exist, because Jesus Christ had not yet, started to found it. Let's say Christianism had not yet been invented. So how do you build a Christian church, a new building type, imitating the shape and forms and look of buildings which were built at a time when that religion did not yet exist? It's almost an impossible problem. And Alberti did what he could. He did a collage or a cut and paste of classical building types. The lower part is what the Romans called a triumphal arch. The pediment is what the Greek would have put on the top of a Greek temple, but the Greek temple was built for a religion which had nothing to do with the Christian religion. And if you go in, he had to invent the plan of a Christian church, and he had no precedent to get inspiration from, and he followed Vitruvius. It's a complicated story, and it was not particularly successful. And the time when this was built, most people at the time thought that this did look a bit strange. But, it was a difficult problem to solve. Now, this new mode of imitation, imitating the forms, but not the content of the art that was being transferred from one civilization to another, became first inadvertently, then more explicitly, little by little, the transfer of form through different contents. The form migrate and stay the same, even the content, the functions, in this case, the religion, has changed. Renaissance artists did not have a name to conceptualize this operation until Vasari, the guy I just mentioned, started to call it a manner. Manner is a certain something that different works of art have in common. It's a feeling, a flair, a generic, pervasive, diffuse but undefinable aura. In the 18th century, the term taste was often used with similar meanings. As of the 19th century, another term took over, which we still use, the term style, which replaced all others. So there you go. As of the 19th century, in European art, style is a term used to define a look, an aura, an undefinable something that different works of art have in common. In this sense, with these meanings, imitation and style were, in the 19th century, the backbone of academic training in the arts. This is what artists learned when they went to school. This is what they specialized in: imitation and style, imitation of the works of the master, scholarly mastery of the style of an age or of a place. This was the foundation of modern art history: imitation and style. In architecture, it started with this book by Heinrich Hübsch in 1828, in which style we should build, and then continuing with Gottfried Semper, way more famous to this day, the style in the technical and tectonical arts, and then Alois Riegel, 1893, questions of style, history of ornament, etc., etc. This is where it started, and as you may have noticed, these were mostly German art historians. And I do not need to tell you that this idea of style and imitation is what modernism eliminated from the arts and design of the 20th century. There are many good reasons why modernist artists, designers in particular, felt averse to the idea of imitation and style, which had dominated 19th century European art theory. Just think of it. If form follows function, the imitation of traditional forms in the absence of the original function is a mistake, or worse. From a modernist vantage point, the Victorian battle of the style was the sign of all that had gone wrong in architecture since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Also, often leading to similar consequences, the Romantic artist does not follow precedent or nature. Visionary geniuses, like this one, which is fictional, I don't know if you know this story, but this is Howard Rourke, the protagonist of a novel by Ayn Rand, The Fountainhead, written towards the end of World War II, and then a movie was made in the early 50s, and this is Gary Cooper impersonating the architect. This is a book that many architects still read, to their detriment, I have to say, but this guy, Howard Rourke, he does not imitate. He's a Romantic artist. In the words of Ayn Rand, who wrote this story, only Parasite imitates. The true artist doesn't imitate. The true artist creates, closes his eyes, and invents new things that make sense only to himself, out of nothing and against all. Yet, the founding fathers of architectural modernism did not eliminate the notion of style altogether. Le Corbusier, for example, aimed at creating a new architectural style, well, his own. And in 1932, in America, modernism itself became a style, famously the International style, that the title of the exhibition at the MoMA in 1932. An all-out crusade against styles was more or less an ideological project of late modernism, something from the 70s and 80s. This is when all imitation came to be seen as identical copy, hence plagiarism. This is when art theory and literary criticism had to bring in synonyms, circumlocutions, euphemism to refer to the same now unmentionable notional fields. Inspiration, influence, as in this famous title of a book by Harold Bloom, sensibility, inclination, affinity. What do all these words mean? They mean style or imitation, except that the terms could not be used. So you cannot say imitation, and you say inspiration, influence, sensibility, inclination, affinity, etc., because imitation was a forbidden word. The history of the demotion or the elimination of ideas of imitation and style from 20th century art theory is a fascinating one. It does admit a few exceptions. First of all, a different mode of imitation based not on merger, fusion, and transfiguration, but on collage, cut and paste, and chunky aggregation existed as an alternative to the dominant style of smooth transfiguration from the very start, from the Renaissance. This is, for example, Michelangelo, which the Americans pronounce Michelangelo, but it's the same person. And you may notice that this composition looks pretty much like a collage, a cut and paste of pieces with different provenance, which is why this Michelangelo architecture was extremely popular with postmodernists. It was a picture which Bob Venturi put on the cover of his first best-selling book. And the same notion of collage and citation was taken over and reconceptualized by modernist art theory in the 20th century. This is, for example, Picasso, Braque, but this is Johan Gris. He made the collage famous in the 20s in modern painting. In architecture, this continued with deconstructivism, with Peter Eisenman, and to some extent, even with postmodernism. But this will be another story. So let's forget about this for the time being and focus on the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that in the late 20th century, in the theory of the visual arts and of architecture, imitation and style were forbidden words, words you could not use. Hence, the artistic practices to which they referred just disappeared because there was no way to mention them, let alone discuss them. There is, hence, a certain irony that the latest avatar of today's electronic technologies is fostering a revival of art theory ideas of imitation and style that 20th century modernism had managed to eliminate from the visual culture of a machine-made environment. This is why I'm telling you this story tonight. Not because I was trained as a classicist, I was, in different times and in a different country, but because today AI technology, generative adversarial networks, GAN, and machine learning in particular are bringing imitation and style back into the practice and theory of the visual arts. This may seem at a glance counterintuitive, but it is happening, which begs the question, how did this happen? Where does this come from? Where did this start? This requires a small technical digression for a few pages, so bear with me. The revolution of machine learning reached the visual arts in the mid-2010s, say 2015, 2016, when a new mode of AI called GAN, Generative Adversarial Networks, was found to be particularly suitable to the manipulation of images. GAN art, or art generated by AI, is now a recognized staple of digital art, and the way it works is well known. GAN artists must first of all gather a collection of related images pertinent to their project. We call this a data set. This data set is then fed into the machine learning algorithm that ferrets out somehow the commonalities among these images, what these images have in common. The result of this process is a mathematical matrix that computer scientists call a latent space, and more or less corresponds to what philosophers would call the definition, the idea, the formula, of the original data set. So for example, if the data set is composed of images of dogs, the corresponding latent space is what philosophers would call the definition of a dog, meaning explaining with words what a dog is, or the idea of a dog, or an ideal dog, showing the image of the perfect dog. This definition, which today is not verbal, not visual, but mathematical, it is vectorial, can be in turn applied to different tasks. Task number 1, analytic, showing the system a new picture and asking, is this a dog? Task number 2, generative, asking the system to produce realistic images of dogs that do not exist, of fake dogs. These are not real dogs. These are dogs generated by AI. Or third step, combinatory, asking the system to merge 2 or more data sets in given proportions, producing, for example, pictures of a canine entity that looks to some different percent dog and coyote. This is a shifting process. So left is 80% dog and 20% coyote. You go right and it is less dog and more coyote. So at the end it's only 20% dog and 80% coyote. So the percent of dog is 80, 60, 40, 20. The percent of coyote is 20, 40, 60, 80. So you shift from left to right and you morph from mostly dog to mostly coyote. The tidal wave of generative AI that has swept the planet since 2 years ago, more or less to the day, has not significantly changed this conceptual framework, but it has introduced 2 important technical innovations. First, the data sets are now composed of text and image pairs, where images are labeled, described with words. Second, these new data sets of text and images are not custom made as they used to be in the old GAN system, when every data set was made by an artist for a specific project. But now the data sets are huge and generic. We call them large language model. They are all-purpose data set, scraped or stolen from all possible sources. User-friendly text-to-image or multimodal tools like Midjourney or DALL-E can create images out of verbal or visual prompts, as if out of thin air. And their almost supernatural capacities have evidently struck a chord with the general public. But the data set on which they are based derive from vast collection of labeled images taken from the public internet. Hence, they can only reflect what the internet has already put together. In this sense, general purpose AI tools like those I just mentioned only automate crowdsourcing by tapping the same collective knowledge that Wikipedia and other social media apps have been putting together, canvassing, soliciting for the last 20 years. Given this context, the almost miraculous images now served on demand by generative AI may be of some use to sociologists or advertising executives, but they appear at first glance only of limited interest to visual artists and designers. Example, if I type the prompt Switzerland into DALL-E, this is what I get. But what I get is an automated visual opinion poll. This is what Switzerland looks like in the mind of most people. This may help the Swiss Tourist Office to design a new website, but that's about it. All the same, the potential of a technology that may one day deliver automated and controllable images from any combination of verbal queries and visual inputs did not fail to register with the design community, eliciting, as could be expected, the latest resurrection of a human versus machine competition. These preoccupations have hidden from sight some very practical consequences of the rise of AI-generated images, which are already being felt in the design professions and in academia and in schools. Machine learning tools based on legacy GANs or the more recent transformers and diffusion models at the basis of DALL-E's stance are making us used to the way today artificial intelligence create images, and they induce us to deal with images in similar ways. And how does AI create images? Well, this is the long and short of it. AI-based image making is at its core a double exercise in similarities. The first part of a GAN process is analytic. It is about detecting similarities. In the example mentioned above, what do all these carefully chosen images of dogs have in common? What visual features make a dog a dog? This inductive process will create the image of an archetypal dog, of an ideal dog. Never mind what computer scientists call it. The second part of the process is generative. How many variations can we introduce in the image of this ideal dog so that it will be different from its model, yet still recognizable as a dog, insofar as it is similar to all the dogs known to the system. The second part of the process, the generative part, is what literally we should call imitation, and was in fact often called that way in the past. The system here is imitating its own archetypal dog by creating as many fake dogs as needed. Next step, if you want to imitate two different data sets at the same time, as in the example of the merging of the dog and the coyote, what is it that we can transfer from one image to another, losing some and keeping other of its distinctive features? How do we call the spirit, the aura, the flavor that characterize the original data set? What's the common feeling that all those images have in common and can be transferred to other content while still being recognizable as a trace or an emanation of the original corpus? In the past, this used to be called a style. And in fact, the computer scientists that invented GANs started calling this operation style transfer in 2016. The term has stuck. It is now embedded in some of the most popular GAN and text-to-image applications, as in this one. This is the interface of Google Deep Dream, I think. But this was changed a few months ago. This is the old historical interface. Now they remade it. But this one explained the logic of the system in an even more transparent way. You choose a base image, that's your own, you upload it. You choose a style image among a selection of styles, which is ready-made and already built by the machine, and then you combine them and you generate a transformation of a picture you have uploaded into a style of your choosing, chosen among a set of ready-made styles. So for example, since we shouldn't always be talking about dogs, here it is a cat. It's not a fake cat, this is a real cat. The cat you see, his name is Robin. I know him well, it's a good cat. So you upload the picture of the cat, that's a real cat. Then you choose the style image, and we chose the style of Piet Mondrian, neoplasticism, Dutch modernism, the 20s was called de stijl, which means in Dutch, the style, but never mind. So combine the picture of the cat with the style of Piet Mondrian, and what you get is the cat as Piet Mondrian would have painted him in 1925. Style transfer. The technical resurrection of the term imitation is more recent, even though imitation learning has long been a recognized branch of artificial intelligence. The term itself gained recognition only in a research paper published by Google DeepMind in January 2023, so 1 year ago and something. Regardless of terminology, visual imitation is what AI-based image-making technologies do, and so do we when we use them. Given the long tradition of creative imitation in Western art history and theory, it comes as no surprise that the engineers, the computer scientists, trying to replicate with mathematical tools some operation of the human mind, felt at some point the instrumental need to call on, resurrect, revive these two ancient terms. What computer scientists probably did not know is that these two terms, imitation and style, have been out of currency for most of the 20th century. And artists and art critics trained in the second half of the last century in particular, and to this day, have either avoided them or tried to eliminate them. So there you go. AI is bringing back to art practice, not yet to art theory, notion of imitation and style that modernist ideology had eliminated from the theory and practice of the visual arts throughout most of the 20th century and almost to this day. Imitation and style, which modernist ideology had kicked out of art theory through the door, are coming back to art practice through the window of technology. And while the art historical theories I mentioned all originate from within the classical European tradition, today image-making technologies do not know any such cultural border, and they are being largely and often enthusiastically adopted, if not outright developed, in countries that have nothing to do with Europe, that were not colonized by Europe, not even exposed to European art theories. It is possible, actually quite likely, that the practice of visual imitation was as frequent in pre-industrial cultures outside of Europe as it was in pre-industrial Europe. And it is even possible that this practice may have survived outside of Europe for longer than it did in Europe itself, where, as I mentioned, industrial modernism eliminated the theory of imitation from the arts and from design of the 20th century. Again, this is not today's topic, so let's leave the matter open for the time being. But be that as it may, and pending this investigation, our problem today remains nonetheless the following. Imitation and styles have been absent from most discourse on the visual arts for 2 generations at least. There were many good reasons why that had to happen. But as a result, we have forgotten, all of us, but particularly in the Eurocentric modernist West, we have all forgotten what imitation is, what it means, how it works. And as technology now automates imitation and obliges us to deal with imitation again after a century-old oblivion, we need to learn again at least the basics of imitation in theory and in practice. So when we use technologies that imitate, at least we know what these technologies do and what we do when we use them. Many of us, as you certainly know, are already using generative AI, or will soon do so, because generative AI can help humans and will soon replace humans in many design tasks. But above and beyond the practical uses of the tool, generative AI is already affecting the general mindset, the mentality of the design professions, of the visual arts in general, in a deeper, more pervasive way. Generative AI is a machine that automates imitation. But as it does so, it reminds us of the nature of creative imitation. Imitation is not a copy, It is inspiration. It is not identical replication. It is assimilation and transfiguration. Seen in these terms, imitation is an indispensable component of every creative expression. There is no creation without imitation. Think of it. Everything we draw is inspired by something we have seen. Everything we write is inspired by something we have read. Everything we say or sing is inspired by something we have heard. Every word we use means something because it has already been used by someone else. This is the way the human mind works. This is the way generative AI appears to work too. A style is a certain something that different works of art have in common. Even if we can prove that one of those works was made first and all the others followed, there is no way to copyright an influence because we can only copyright a copy. Copyright means literally right of copy. There is no right of influence. There is no patent on inspiration, no intellectual property on style. When we need to learn something, we go to school or we get training. And for that, we pay tuition fees, not royalties. Teachers who teach architecture and design studio are paid a salary for the time they spend teaching, not royalties for the permission to look at the buildings they built. If this principle applies to human learning, the same should apply to machine learning too. More importantly, generative AI, which is a technology, reminds us of the cultural function of precedent in all human communication. When we use AI, all creation is a transfiguration of some precedent of choice, which computer scientists call a dataset. It all starts with a dataset. There is no generation without a dataset. But unrelated to computer science, plenty of theories, from Renaissance aesthetics to modern structural linguistics, have similarly argued that there is no invention without convention, no creativity without a code, no individual expression without a language. Hence, it would appear that for artificial intelligence and for human intelligence alike, the first step in every creative process resides in the awareness, acknowledgement, election, and selection of our precedent of reference and of our reference to precedent. Precedent, that tradition, that language, that system into which we inscribe ourselves, that canon of our own choosing that gives meaning to our voice. This is what generative AI teaches us and what we should remember when we use it, and even when we don't. Every data set is a canon, and every canon is a data set. When we work with pen and paper on our own, we may easily forget that we must have made or chosen our own canon at some point. So we may delude ourselves and think that there is no canon. But with generative AI, there is no way to cheat because the technical logic of generative AI is transparent. If it works, it is because someone, somewhere, must have made a dataset, chosen a canon. Every dataset is a selection based on preference, our preference or someone else's, even when, as in the case of today's large language models, that selection reflects the choices and biases of a corporation, a community, a crowd, or even a nation. And we know all too well these days that preference may lead to or come from prejudice. At the start of each creative process, someone must have decided to include something or someone, hence to exclude something or someone. It is as simple as that. This is the teaching of generative AI. We cannot create without a data set. We cannot escape precedent. Sometimes we may try to tweak it, but more often we must take precedent as it is. And yet, fortunately, there is one choice we can still and always make. While many may be happy to endorse the canon they are given, we can always show, if necessary, that we don't. We can celebrate the canon or make it clear, explicitly clear if needed, that even if we must use that canon, we may not like it. We can, in short, critique the canon. I know it's not easy, but this is what some of us have been doing for quite some while, and some still do. And this is my last word for tonight. Thank you.